Welcome to Mystic Sleep Tales. Before we journey together into the quietness of this evening, I would like you to find yourself in a position of complete comfort, perhaps lying down with your head resting softly upon your pillow, or seated in a manner that allows your body to release the tensions that have gathered throughout the day. Let your eyes gently close if they have not already done so, and feel the weight of your head pressing into whatever surface supports it, noticing how that surface rises to meet you with steadiness and care. Take a breath, not a forced or measured one, but simply the breath that comes naturally when you remember to notice it. And as you release that breath, allow your shoulders to sink downward, away from your ears, letting go of the invisible burden they have been carrying without your conscious knowledge. There is nothing you need to do in this moment, no task that requires your attention, no obligation that pulls at your thoughts. The day has concluded its demands upon you, and the night offers its particular gift of stillness and reprieve. Let your jaw relax, unclenching if it has been held tight, and feel your tongue rest easily in your mouth, no longer forming words or holding tension. Your hands, wherever they lie, can simply be hands at rest, fingers loosely curled or extended as they wish, requiring nothing of themselves. Even your feet, so often forgotten at the ends of your legs, can release their grip on the day, toes softening, arches flattening slightly into whatever rests beneath them. As you continue to breathe in this gentle, unhurried way, you might notice sounds around you, the creaks and whispers of a house settling, the distant murmur of wind or rain, the barely perceptible hum of modern life that surrounds us always. These sounds need not disturb you. They are simply there, like the air itself, and you can let them wash over you without grasping at them or pushing them away. Your mind, which has been so active and alert throughout the waking hours, can begin now to slow its rapid turning, like a wheel that gradually loses momentum, still moving, but with less urgency, less insistence. Thoughts will come, as thoughts always do, but you need not follow them on their journeys. You can simply observe them passing, like clouds across a vast sky, drifting through without requirement or judgment. Allow yourself now to feel heavy, pleasantly heavy, as though your body is made of something dense and warm, sinking gently into the bed or chair that holds you, becoming part of the surface beneath you. There is a particular quality to this heaviness, a welcoming weight that speaks of rest and release, of muscles no longer working to hold you upright or move you forward. From the crown of your head down through your neck and shoulders, along your arms to your fingertips, down through your chest and belly, through your hips and legs to the very ends of your toes, this heaviness spreads like warm honey, slow and thorough and deeply comforting. You are safe here, in this space you have created for yourself, in this moment that belongs entirely to you and to rest. And as you rest here, breathing softly, sinking gently, releasing slowly, we can begin to let your awareness drift toward another place, another time, where the night is also settling into its deepest hours, where work has been completed and a different kind of stillness prevails. You need not go anywhere yourself. You are precisely where you should be, comfortable and heavy and at ease. But your attention, your gentle awareness, can travel backward through the years, can find its way to a particular room in a particular building in a time when gas lamps flickered in the streets and coal fires warmed the homes of those who could afford such warmth. When the world moved more slowly and the night was darker and more complete than we know it now. Let us together find ourselves aware of a bakery, not in the busy hours of the day when customers press against the counter and the ovens roar with fresh fires, but in the deep quietness of the hours after midnight, when the last loaf has been drawn from the heat and placed upon the cooling racks to rest, when the coal fire in the great brick oven has been damped down to glowing embers that pulse with fading warmth. When the journeyman baker has finally climbed the narrow stairs to his small room above the shop, his day's labor completed at last after beginning the previous evening at 11 o'clock. The shop itself is dark. The front room where bread is sold during the day, now shuttered and still, but here in the back room, in the working heart of the bakery, a single lamp burns with low flame upon a wooden table scarred with decades of use, its golden light reaching only a short distance into the surrounding dimness before giving way to shadow. The air in this room holds a particular quality that cannot be found anywhere else, a warmth that is both physical and something more than physical. The retained heat of the great oven that dominates one entire wall, its brick face still emanating the hours of fire it has held, though the flames themselves have now subsided to scattered embers that occasionally shift and settle with small sounds like whispered conversation. The oven was built into the wall when this building was constructed 30 years earlier, in the middle years of Her Majesty's reign, its bricks arranged by masons who knew the old methods, who understood how to create the dome that would hold heat evenly and release it slowly, who knew the proper proportions of the fire chamber and the thickness of the walls that would separate the baking bread from the flames that cooked it. The oven door, a heavy thing of cast iron fitted with a handle worn smooth by countless hands, stands slightly ajar, allowing the faintest glow to escape, a warm orange light that shifts and wavers as the coals settle into themselves, consuming the last of the wooden coal that fed them through the long night. Against the opposite wall, beneath two small windows that look out onto the narrow lane behind the building, stand the cooling racks, simple wooden frames with iron rods running horizontally at intervals of several inches, creating shelves where the bread rests in rows. The racks are tall, reaching nearly to the ceiling, and they hold the evening's production, loaves of various sizes arranged with careful attention to air circulation, for bread must cool properly or it will grow soggy and dense, the moisture trapped within it turning the crumb heavy and unpleasant. There are quartern loaves, each weighing 4 pounds and 5½ ounces as required by law, their crusts dark brown and split along the tops where the dough expanded in the oven's heat. There are half-peck loaves, larger and rounder, their surfaces dusted with flour that is baked into the crust, creating pale patches against the darker brown. There are smaller loaves as well, cottage loaves with their distinctive shape of one round sitting atop another, and long loaves that the French influence has introduced to English baking, though they are not yet common in this particular shop, where tradition holds sway and the customers expect the bread their mothers and grandmothers bought before them. The bread has been cooling for some hours now, ever since it was removed from the oven just after midnight, carried on long wooden peels from the hot brick floor where it baked, and placed carefully upon the racks to rest. When it first emerged, the loaves were still singing, the crust crackling and popping as the sudden change in temperature caused the surface to contract, tiny fissures forming and releasing steam in a sound that every baker knows and loves, the voice of bread speaking its satisfaction. Now, hours later, that singing has faded to the occasional quiet creak or whisper, the internal temperature of the loaves having dropped from the 93 to 97 degrees Celsius. They reached in the oven down toward the 32 to 43 degrees that will make them ready for sale, cool enough to be handled and wrapped, their crumbs set, and their moisture properly distributed between crust and interior. The wooden table that stands in the center of the room bears the evidence of the night's work. A fine dusting of flour that has settled into its grain, a few scattered seeds that have fallen from the tops of loaves, a smear of water where the baker wiped his hands before dampening the oven floor, a practice that creates steam and helps the crust develop its particular character. The table is old as the building itself, its top worn concave in the center where generations of bakers have worked their dough, kneading and shaping, folding and pressing, their hands following patterns learned through years of practice until the movements become as natural as breathing. The wood is stained dark in places, lighter in others, a map of use and time that speaks of countless loaves, countless nights of labor in the dim light before dawn. Above the table, hanging from hooks driven into the ceiling beams, are the tools of the trade, implements that would be familiar to any baker in any century. Their peels, long paddles that would use to slide bread into the oven and retrieve it, their surfaces smooth from use, their edges slightly charred from proximity to heat. There are scrapers for working dough, curved blades for slashing the tops of loaves before they enter the oven, allowing the bread to expand properly and creating the distinctive patterns that mark each baker's work. There is a brush made of stiff bristles, used to sweep flour from the oven floor before the bread goes in, and another brush with softer bristles for applying water or egg wash to the tops of loaves, giving them shine and color. These tools hang motionless in the lamplight, their shadows long and still upon the whitewashed wall behind them. The floor of the bakery is made of stone flags, large flat pieces of limestone laid directly upon the earth, worn smooth by decades of feet moving across them, darkened in paths that show where the baker walks most often, from the work table to the oven, from the oven to the cooling racks, from the cooling racks to the narrow door that leads to the front shop. In the corners, where the sweeping brush cannot quite reach, small accumulations of flour have gathered, mixed with coal dust from the oven and the general soot that comes from heating with coal in a city where every chimney pours its smoke into the air above. The room smells of bread, of course, that warm yeasty scent that permeates everything, that settles into the walls and the wooden beams, that clings to the baker's clothes even when he has washed them. But beneath that dominant smell are others, subtler and equally present. The slight sharpness of coal smoke, the mineral scent of the stone floor, the mustiness of the flour sacks stacked against the wall, the faint sweetness of the wooden shelves that hold the cooling bread. In the deep silence of these hours after midnight, sounds emerge that would be lost during the day's activity, small sounds that speak of the room's existence independent of human purpose. The coals in the oven shift with a soft susurration, settling into new configurations as their substance is consumed by slow burning, occasionally releasing a tiny shower of sparks that flare briefly and die, their light too faint to reach beyond the oven door. The wooden cooling racks expand and contract minutely as the temperature in the room fluctuates by fractions of a degree, the iron rods that support the loaves creaking almost imperceptibly, a sound so quiet that it sits at the very edge of hearing, more felt than heard. The bread itself continues its gradual transformation, the interior moisture slowly migrating toward the crust, which softens slightly from its initial crisp hardness, becoming leathery rather than brittle, achieving the texture that will make it pleasant to eat, that will allow it to be sliced without shattering, to be torn without crumbling. Outside the small windows, the lane is completely dark, no street lamps reaching this far from the main thoroughfare, no light escaping from the neighboring buildings where occupants sleep in rooms stacked one above another, families pressed together in spaces too small for their numbers, breathing the same air over and over until morning comes and they can open their windows to the day. The darkness is absolute in the way that only a Victorian city night can be dark, before electric lights began to push back the shadows, when the moon and stars provided the only illumination once the sun had set and the few gas lamps along the better streets had been extinguished for economy's sake. This darkness seems to press against the windows, to pool in the corners of the room where the lamp's light cannot reach, a presence rather than an absence, something thick and substantial and complete. The lamp itself, standing upon the table, burns steadily, its flame protected from drafts by a glass chimney that must be cleaned each morning of the soot that accumulates, its reservoir of oil sufficient to last through the night and into the early hours of morning when the baker will return to begin the next day's work, arriving while the city still sleeps to mix his dough and fire his oven so that fresh bread will be ready when the first customers arrive. The lamp is a simple thing, utilitarian rather than decorative, its brass base tarnished despite regular polishing, its glass chimney slightly clouded from years of use. The flame burns yellow and small, consuming the oil with patient steadiness, casting its light in a pool that encompasses the table and reaches partway to the walls, leaving the upper reaches of the room in shadow, the ceiling beams barely visible as dark lines against slightly less dark space. On the wooden table, beside the lamp, sits a tin cup half full of water, the liquid settled and still, its surface perfectly level, reflecting the lamp's flame as a wavering point of light. The cup has been there since the baker finished his work, set down when he took his last drink before climbing the stairs to his room, and it will remain there until morning when he returns and carries it to the small sink in the corner, where a pump draws water from the well in the yard behind the building. The cup is dented on one side, the tin showing through where the enamel coating has chipped away, and there is a slight brown stain inside, where tea has been drunk too many times to count, the tannins etching themselves into the metal in a pattern that no amount of scrubbing will remove. Next to the cup lies a cloth, a square of rough linen used for countless purposes throughout the night, for wiping hands and cleaning the table, for handling hot pans and covering rising dough, now folded loosely and resting where it was last set down, its fabric holding creases that show how it has been used, stiff in places with dried dough, soft in others from repeated washing. The warmth in the room is not the aggressive heat of earlier hours when the oven was at full roar, when the fire had to be maintained at temperature sufficient to bake bread properly, when coal was fed regularly to the flames and the air shimmered with heat that made the baker sweat despite the cold November night outside. Now the warmth is gentler, more diffuse, the residual heat of the oven spreading gradually through the brick and into the air, warming the stone floor, rising to the ceiling, creating a temperature that is comfortable without being oppressive, that invites stillness and rest rather than activity and effort. This is the warmth that the bread needs for proper cooling, warm enough to prevent condensation from forming on the crusts, cool enough to allow the internal temperature to drop at the proper rate. The balance that experienced bakers understand through years of practice rather than through any written instruction or precise measurement. The brick face of the oven occupies the entire eastern wall of the room, rising from the stone floor to within a few feet of the ceiling, a massive structure that represents a significant portion of the building's cost when it was constructed. For a good oven is essential to a baker's trade and cannot be built cheaply or quickly. The bricks are common red brick, made from local clay and fired in kilns, each one slightly different from its neighbors in shade and texture, arranged in patterns that the mason deemed proper for strength and heat retention. The mortar between the bricks has darkened over the years, stained by smoke and heat, cracked in places from the constant expansion and contraction that comes from being heated and cooled daily, but still holding firm, still doing its work of binding brick to brick and creating a structure that will last for generations if properly maintained. The oven door, currently ajar, is set into an iron frame that was cast specifically for this oven, its surface decorated with simple molding that speaks of function rather than ornament, its handle positioned at the height that allows the baker to open and close it without excessive bending or reaching. Through the opening of the door, the interior of the oven is visible, or would be if there were more light, but in the dimness only the faint glow of remaining coals can be seen, scattered across the floor of the baking chamber, pulsing slowly as air movement feeds them minute quantities of oxygen, their substance gradually diminishing as carbon combines with air and releases heat and light in the ancient transformation that humans have used since they first learned to control fire. The bricks inside the oven are blackened from years of smoke, their surfaces glazed in places where minerals in the clay have melted and reformed, creating a patina that actually helps the oven hold heat more efficiently, that experienced bakers value and would never try to clean away. The floor of the oven is made of fire brick, a special type of brick designed to withstand direct contact with flame and the weight of bread being baked upon it, its surface worn smooth from being swept clean countless times with a long-handled brush, from having wooden peels slid across it as bread is loaded and unloaded, from the thermal stress of being heated to several hundred degrees and then allowed to cool, day after day, year after year. Against the wall near the oven stand several sacks of flour, the fundamental ingredient of the baker's work, each sack made of heavy cloth and stamped with the name of the mill from which it came, a mill somewhere in the countryside where wheat is ground between massive stones turned by water power, the grain crushed and separated into various grades of flour, the finest and whitest kept for the bread of the wealthy, the coarser and darker flour used for the bread of the poor, though this particular bakery produces bread of middling quality, neither the finest nor the coarsest, serving a clientele of shopkeepers and clerks, skilled workers, and small merchants, people who can afford bread that is properly made, but who do not demand a refinement that costs extra. The sacks slump against one another, their contents settling into the bottom, the cloth developing creases and folds that show the weight they contain, and a fine dust of flour has escaped through the weave of the fabric to settle on the floor around them, creating pale patches against the darker stone. Beside the flour sacks stands a wooden barrel containing salt, its lid secured with a simple latch to keep out moisture and pests. And next to that is a smaller container holding the yeast that brings bread to life, transforming simple ingredients into something greater than their sum. Though this particular bakery uses barm rather than the compressed yeast that will become common in later years. Barm being the froth skimmed from fermenting beer, rich with the wild yeast that cause fermentation, kept alive by adding flour and water periodically, maintaining a culture that may have been started years ago and passed from baker to baker like a living inheritance. The container of barm sits in a slightly warmer spot near the oven, for yeast prefers warmth and will grow sluggish and eventually die if kept too cold, and the baker checks it daily, feeding it when necessary, judging its readiness by smell and appearance, knowledge that cannot be written in books but must be learned through observation and practice. The loaves on the cooling racks have now reached a stage where they are no longer actively changing, no longer crackling and settling, no longer releasing visible steam into the air around them. They have achieved a kind of equilibrium, their internal temperature still slightly above the temperature of the room, but no longer dropping rapidly, their crust set and firm, their crumb fully formed and stable. In a few more hours, when morning comes and the baker returns to his work, these loaves will be ready to be moved to the shop, to be arranged on shelves and in the window where customers can see them, to be sold and carried home and sliced and eaten, fulfilling the purpose for which they were made. But for now, in these quiet hours, they simply rest, existing in the state between creation and consumption, between the fire that transformed them and the hunger that will claim them, occupying a space of completion and waiting. The shadows in the room shift almost imperceptibly as the lamp flame wavers, responding to air currents too subtle to feel, movements caused by the warmth of the oven rising and cooler air from the windows descending, creating gentle circulation that prevents the room from becoming stagnant, but is too slow and quiet to disturb the stillness. The shadows of the hanging tools move fractionally against the wall, their edges softening and sharpening as the light that creates them fluctuates, and the shadow of the lamp itself creates a dark circle on the table around its base, a zone of darkness in the midst of light, the natural consequence of an object blocking the very light it generates. These shadows are deep and soft, not the harsh black shadows of direct sunlight, but the layered gradations of lamplight in a dim room, shadows that suggest rather than define, that create depth and mystery rather than clear delineation. From somewhere far away, muffled by distance and the intervening walls of buildings, comes the sound of the sound of the bell. The room's stillness deepens after the bells cease, as though the sound had temporarily animated something that now returns to rest, settling back into the particular quality of quiet that belongs to the hours between midnight and dawn. The oven's residual warmth continues its slow radiation into the room, a process that will continue for hours yet, for the brick mass of the oven holds tremendous amounts of thermal energy and releases it gradually, like a large stone that has been sitting in the sun and remains warm long after the sun has set. This is one of the beauties of masonry ovens, this ability to store heat and release it slowly, creating an environment that changes gradually rather than in sudden jumps, that provides consistent warmth without the need for constant fuel, that makes efficient use of the coal and wood that must be purchased and stored and fed to the fire. In the winter months, this residual heat helps warm the baker's living quarters above, reducing the amount of coal needed for the small grate in his room, a saving that makes a meaningful difference to a man whose profits are measured in pence and shillings rather than pounds. who must carefully account for every expense against the uncertain income that comes from selling bread in a neighborhood where customers are always looking for the cheapest price and will go to a competitor for the savings of a farthing on a loaf. The room contains other objects, visible in the lamplight or existing just beyond its reach, things that are part of the baker's daily work, but which now rest unused in the night hours. There is a wooden bucket near the pump, used for carrying water to mix with the flour when making dough, its interior stained dark from repeated wetting and drying. A slight film of mineral deposits on its sides where water has evaporated, leaving behind the salts and other substances it carried from the well. There is a set of scales hanging from a hook, for bread must be sold by weight, and the law requires that loaves conform to certain standards. The scales themselves a balance type with two pans suspended from a central beam, weights of various denominations arranged in a row nearby. Each weight carefully maintained, because selling underweight bread can result in fines that a small baker cannot afford. There is a long-handled ash rake leaning against the wall near the oven, used to pull the coals to the front of the oven or to spread them evenly across the floor when a level bed of heat is needed, its handle smoothed by hands gripping it while working near intense heat, its metal end blackened and slightly warped from years of use in the fire. On a shelf above the work table sit several vessels and containers, a jug that held water for the baker to drink during his long night's work, a ceramic pot that contains lard for greasing bread pans when such are used, though most of the bread in this shop is baked directly on the oven floor in the traditional manner. A small box holding the nubs of pencils used for keeping accounts and marking the baker's notebook, where he records each day's production, the amounts of flour and other ingredients used, the number of loaves baked and sold, the information that allows him to track his business and make the small adjustments in his work that determine whether he makes a profit or a loss in any given week. The notebook itself lies closed on the table, a cheap thing of rough paper stitched together and covered in gray cardboard, its pages filled with numbers and brief notes in a hand that is more practiced at shaping dough than forming letters. The writing cramped and sometimes difficult to read, but sufficient for its purpose. A record that will be kept for several years and then discarded when the information it contains is no longer useful. When the daily transactions it documents have faded into the undifferentiated past that is the fate of most human activity. The ceiling above all this is crossed by heavy beams. The structural timber of the building, dark with age and smoke, their surfaces rough-hewn from the saw that cut them from the log, for in this period economy dictates that would be prepared with the minimum of finishing, that surfaces which will not be seen need not be planed smooth or otherwise refined. These beams support the floor of the rooms above, where the baker sleeps in his small chamber, where perhaps a journeyman or an apprentice also has a narrow bed, where the structure of the building creaks and settles in the night as the various materials that compose it expand and contract with changes in temperature and humidity, the wood shrinking slightly in the dry warmth from the oven below, the mortar between bricks absorbing moisture from the air and then releasing it again, the building engaged in its own slow rhythms of movement and adjustment that have nothing to do with human purpose, but are simply the consequence of materials behaving according to their nature. Between the ceiling beams, the space is filled with plaster, visible in places where it has cracked or fallen away to reveal the lath beneath, thin strips of wood nailed across the beams to provide a surface for the plaster to grip, the old method of creating ceilings before the introduction of pressed metal or other materials that would come in later years. The plaster is stained in patches, darkened by smoke that has risen from the lamp and from the oven over the years. And in one area, there is evidence of a leak that has since been repaired, a water stain that has dried to a yellowish-brown color. The plaster slightly swollen and softened where moisture penetrated before the roof above was patched. These imperfections speak to the age of the building, to the constant maintenance required to keep structures functional in an era when building materials are solid and long-lasting, but also subject to decay and damage. When repairs are made as economics allow rather than according to any scheduled maintenance, when a building serves its purpose despite its flaws rather than because it has been maintained in perfect condition. The two small windows on the back wall are fitted with glass panes, a relative luxury in a working space where simpler and cheaper materials might have been used, but the baker has found that having light during the day makes his work easier and safer, that being able to see clearly while handling hot bread and working near the fire reduces accidents and improves the quality of his product. The glass is old, made in small panes because large sheets were expensive and prone to breaking, each pane slightly uneven in thickness and containing small bubbles and imperfections that distort the view through them. Though in the darkness of this hour there is nothing to see in any case, just the absolute black of the lane outside pressing against the glass. The window frames are wooden, painted at some point in the past, but now showing bare wood in many places where the paint has worn away or flaked off, the wood itself weathered gray where it is exposed to the elements, swollen in places from absorbing moisture, providing an imperfect seal that allows small drafts to enter the room, not enough to be truly uncomfortable, but sufficient to cause the lamp flame to waver occasionally, to create gentle movement in the otherwise still air. The bread on the cooling racks, if one were to approach closely and examine it with attention, shows the individual characteristics of each loaf. For while the baker works to create uniformity, each loaf is shaped by hand and therefore bears the subtle marks of its creation. Some loaves are slightly more rounded than others. Some have splits in the crust that run in different directions. Some are darker in color, where they were positioned closer to the most intense heat in the oven. Some are paler, where they were at the cooler edges of the baking chamber. The flour dusting on the crust is distributed unevenly, thicker in some areas than others. And here and there a loaf bears the print of the wooden peel that carried it, a slight flattening on one side, where the wood pressed against the dough as it was slid into the oven. These variations would be noticed and perhaps criticized by a perfectionist, but they are normal and expected in bread made by hand. They do not affect the quality or taste of the bread in any meaningful way, and the customers who buy these loaves tomorrow will accept them gladly, will carry them home wrapped in paper or in their arms, will slice them and eat them without thinking about the small irregularities that mark them as products of human labor rather than machine uniformity. The stone floor continues to release the day's accumulated footsteps and movement, settling into the nighttime stillness as though the very stones are breathing out tension and breathing in rest, preparing for tomorrow's renewal of activity when feet will once again cross them in purposeful patterns, when flour will once again be scattered and swept, when water will once again be spilled and mopped. When the cycle of work that defines this space will begin again as it has begun every morning. For 3 decades, and will continue to begin every morning until either the building falls down or the nature of baking changes so fundamentally that these old methods are no longer practiced. But that is tomorrow's concern and tomorrow's movement. For now, in this suspended moment of the deep night, the floor simply is existing in its stoneness, supporting the weight of table and oven and racks and bread, fulfilling its function through simple presence rather than through any active doing. The bricks of the oven wall, visible in the lamplight, show variations in color that speak to their individual origins, for bricks are natural products made from clay that varies in composition depending on where it was dug, and even bricks from the same clay bed will show differences depending on where they were positioned in the kiln during firing. Bricks near the firebox becoming darker and harder. Bricks at the cooler edges of the kiln remaining lighter and more porous. All these variations, accepted as normal and even desirable, for they create a visual texture that enlivens the surface rather than presenting a monotonous uniformity. The mortar between the bricks has been applied with practiced skill, the joints relatively even in thickness, the excess mortar scraped away before it hardened, creating lines that define each brick while holding them together in a structure that is stronger than any individual brick could be, the whole greater than the sum of its parts in a way that is characteristic of masonry construction. Multiple weak elements combined through proper arrangement and good mortar into a strong and durable assembly. The door frame of the oven, that cast iron structure into which the door itself fits, is secured to the brick with heavy bolts that extend deep into the masonry, anchored with lead or mortar to create a rigid connection. For the door frame must withstand the thermal expansion and contraction that comes from being heated repeatedly, while also supporting the weight of the door and resisting the force applied when the door is opened and closed dozens of times each day. The iron shows surface rust in places where moisture has penetrated the paint or where the paint has been chipped away by the impact of tools or the scraping of the bread peel, orange-brown patches that contrast with the black of the painted areas. Evidence of the constant battle against oxidation that characterizes the use of iron in environments where heat and moisture are present. A battle that can be held in check, but never permanently won, requiring ongoing attention and maintenance to prevent the slow deterioration that would otherwise consume the metal. The cooling racks, those simple structures of wood and iron that hold the bread in its transition from hot to cool, from fire to air, occupy their space along the wall with a kind of stolid permanence. Their function so basic and their design so straightforward that they seem almost inevitable, as though no other arrangement could possibly serve the same purpose with equal efficiency. The wooden uprights that form the frame are made of pine or some similar softwood, chosen for economy rather than any special quality. Their surface is unfinished except for the smoothing that came from the sawmill. Their color the natural pale tone of seasoned pine, darkened slightly with age and exposure to the air and the various substances present in a bakery. The iron rods that form the shelves are round bar stock, perhaps 3/4 of an inch in diameter, secured through holes drilled in the wooden uprights and held in place with the friction of a tight fit, strong enough to support the weight of multiple loaves without bending, spaced at intervals that allow air to circulate around each loaf while maximizing the number of loaves that can be stored in the available vertical space. Each loaf rests on the rods with only a small portion of its bottom surface making contact. The rounded shape of the loaf and the spacing of the rods combining to ensure that air can move beneath as well as around each loaf, for cooling requires that heat be able to escape from all surfaces, and a loaf resting flat on a solid surface would cool unevenly, the bottom remaining warmer than the top and sides. Moisture potentially condensing where the bread meets the surface, creating conditions that could lead to sogginess or even mold growth if the bread were left long enough. The spacing of the loaves on the racks follows patterns learned through experience, each loaf positioned so that it does not touch its neighbors, so that air can circulate freely around all sides, the arrangement both practical and aesthetic, creating regular rows and columns that please the eye while serving the functional purpose of efficient cooling. The small sounds of the room continue in their random occurrence. The settling of a coal in the oven, the faint creak of a cooling rack expanding or contracting with temperature change, the almost inaudible sound of the lamp flame consuming its fuel, sounds that would not register as notable during the day when other sounds would mask them, but which in the deep night acquire a presence disproportionate to their actual volume, becoming markers of time's passage in an environment where little else changes, where the visual scene remains static, and only these tiny auditory events provide evidence that time is indeed moving forward, that this moment is different from the moment before it and from the moment that will follow it, even though to the eye everything appears suspended in timeless stillness. The air in the room has reached a kind of equilibrium, the warmth from the oven balanced against the cold that seeps in through gaps around the windows and through the walls themselves, which though thick are not insulated in any modern sense, but simply rely on their mass to moderate the temperature difference between inside and outside. The result is a temperature that is comfortable without being warm, that requires no particular adjustment from someone accustomed to the ambient temperatures of a building in winter, that allows the bread to cool at the proper rate while maintaining enough warmth to prevent condensation, the baker's long experience having taught him exactly how to manage the fire and the venting of the oven to create these conditions. Knowledge that exists in his hands and his judgment rather than in any written instruction, passed from master to apprentice through demonstration and practice rather than through verbal explanation, the kind of tacit knowledge that characterizes skilled crafts and that cannot easily be codified or transferred except through direct experience. The lamp continues its patient illumination of the scene, casting the same pool of yellow light, creating the same patterns of shadow, providing the same gentle visibility that allows the room to be something other than complete darkness, its flame unchanging in its essential character, even as it constantly consumes fuel and produces light, a paradox of stability and change that mirrors the larger rhythms of the bakery, where the same tasks are performed night after night, week after week, year after year, creating bread that is consumed and disappears, requiring that more bread be made in an endless cycle of production and consumption that continues as long as people need to eat and bakers are willing to do the work of making bread. The lamp's light touches the bread on the racks, highlighting the curves and planes of the crusts, creating tiny shadows in the splits and creases, making visible the texture that gives bread its particular character, the surface that will be pleasant to touch and to bite through, that will make eating bread a sensory experience engaging multiple senses, sight and smell and taste and touch, all contributing to the satisfaction that comes from consuming bread made with skill and care. The walls of the room, whitewashed at some point in the past, though now showing years of accumulated smoke and flour dust, extend upward to meet the ceiling, their surfaces uneven where the plaster was applied with less than perfect smoothness, where cracks have formed and been filled or left to expand as the building settles and shifts with the seasons, where nails and hooks have been driven in to hang various items, and then perhaps removed, leaving holes that have not been filled. All the minor imperfections that accumulate in a working space where appearance is secondary to function, where the walls serve their purpose of enclosing and defining space, of providing surface to reflect lamplight back into the room, of separating the bakery from the adjacent buildings and creating a defined zone where bread is made, distinct from the other activities that occur in this neighborhood of shops and small manufactories and dwellings pressed close together in the urban density that characterizes Victorian cities. The oven door, hanging slightly open on its hinges, allows the faint glow from within to escape into the room, a glow that adds almost nothing to the illumination provided by the lamp, but which serves as a visual reminder of the fire that has burned there, of the heat that has cooked the bread, and that still resides in the brick mass waiting to be slowly released into the night. The door itself is heavy. It's cast iron thick enough to withstand years of use and abuse. Its inner surface scarred and pitted from exposure to intense heat. Its outer surface painted black, though the paint is worn away in places from contact with tools and hands, revealing the iron beneath. The handle is positioned for comfortable gripping, its metal worn smooth and shiny from thousands of hands grasping it, pulling the door open and pushing it closed in the endless repetition of the baking process, and the hinges that support the door show signs of the weight they bear, the metal slightly deformed where pins press against their housings. A thin film of grease or oil applied periodically to prevent the squealing that would otherwise announce each opening and closing of the door. The bread has now been resting on a rack long enough that a person entering the room would scarcely be able to detect that it had recently been baked, the obvious signs of recent baking having faded into the general warmth and scent of the bakery, the bread having assumed the temperature and quiescence that will characterize it until it is sold and removed from this space. Each loaf sits in its position on the rack, maintaining the shape it was given when it was formed by the baker's hands, the shape that was modified by the expansion during baking, the oven spring that pushes the dough upward and outward as the heat causes the gases within to expand and the yeast to experience a final burst of fermentation before the heat kills it, creating the light and airy texture that makes bread pleasant to eat rather than dense and heavy. The transformation from dough to bread being one of the fundamental accomplishments of human culture, a skill developed over thousands of years and refined through countless generations of bakers, each generation passing its knowledge to the next, maintaining traditions while also making small innovations that gradually accumulate into the differences between ancient and modern baking. The tools hanging above the work table cast their shadows on the wall, elongated and distorted by the angle of the lamplight, their forms recognizable but abstracted, made mysterious by the transformation that shadow creates, the way it strips away detail and reduces complex objects to simple silhouettes, the way it emphasizes shape while removing texture and color, creating a parallel world of darkness that accompanies the lit world but remains separate from it, accessible only through imagination or through the knowledge of what objects create with shadows, a knowledge that comes from familiarity with this space and these tools from having worked here long enough that the location and appearance of every item is known without conscious thought. These shadows move imperceptibly as the lamp flame wavers, their edges softening and sharpening in response to changes in the light that creates them, participating in the slow dance of light and dark that plays out continuously in any space illuminated by flame. A dance that electric light will eventually replace with its steady, unchanging illumination, but which for now remains the characteristic quality of nighttime interior spaces, the flickering uncertainty that makes shadows seem almost alive, that creates an atmosphere of movement and change even in a room where nothing is actually moving except the flame itself and the air that feeds it. The floor beneath all this, those stone flags laid decades ago, continues to support the weight of everything above it, transferring that weight down to the earth beneath the building, performing its function with the silent reliability that characterizes good construction, never announcing its presence or requiring attention unless something goes wrong, content to be the foundation upon which all other elements of the bakery rest. The stones are cold to the touch, even this room warmed by the oven's residual heat, for stone conducts heat poorly and the mass of the floor extends down into the ground, where temperatures remain relatively constant regardless of what happens in the air above, the earth itself acting as a thermal reservoir that moderates extremes in both directions, preventing the floor from becoming either very hot or very cold, maintaining a temperature that is cooler than the room in winter and warmer than the room in summer, though in this moment of late autumn moving toward winter, the floor's temperature and the room's temperature are close enough that the difference would be barely noticeable except by direct contact, by standing barefoot on the stones and feeling their coolness against the soles of one's feet, a sensation that the baker knows well from the mornings when he comes down from his room above before bothering to put on his shoes, padding across the cold stone in his stocking feet or barefoot, the chill of the floor helping to wake him and prepare him for the long day's work ahead. The room exists now in a state of maximum quietness, the deepest part of the night, when even the occasional sound from outside have ceased, when the neighborhood sleeps most profoundly, when the city itself seems to pause in its constant activity and allow a few hours of genuine rest, of silence broken only by the sounds that buildings make as they exist in the darkness, the small adjustments and settlements that occur independently of human activity, the creaks and whispers that speak of materials responding to temperature and gravity and time. This is the hour when the boundary between sleep and waking becomes thin, when dreams seem most vivid and consciousness seems most tenuous, when the ordinary world takes on a quality of strangeness and mystery, as though the familiar has been transformed by darkness into something new and unknown, as though the bakery in the depth of night is a different place entirely from the bakery in the working hours of the day, inhabited by different spirits or subject to different laws, a magical thinking that rational minds dismiss, but that nevertheless persists in the human imagination, that finds expression in the stories told about night and darkness, about the uncanny quality of familiar places encountered at unfamiliar times. The bread, that practical substance made for eating, that everyday commodity that will be sold for coins and consumed for sustenance, participates in this transformation, becoming in the depth of night something more than mere bread, becoming a presence that speaks to the human need for food and the human skill in transforming raw materials into nourishment, becoming a symbol of the cycle of work and rest, of creation and consumption, of the way that human activity structures time and gives meaning to the hours of the day and night. These loaves resting on their racks are both completely ordinary and somehow extraordinary, both exactly what they appear to be and something more, both the product of simple ingredients and simple processes, and also the culmination of thousands of years of human culture, of agricultural development and milling technology and baking knowledge, of social organization that allows some people to specialize in making bread while others pursue different occupations, of economic systems that permit the exchange of bread for money and money for other goods, of all the complex arrangements that make possible the simple act of buying a loaf of bread and taking it home to eat. And so the night continues, the hours passing with their characteristic slowness, the bakery existing in its state of quiet completion, the bread cooling in its progression toward the temperature and condition that will make it ready for sale, the lamp burning steadily through its reservoir of oil, the oven releasing its stored heat into the surrounding space, the shadows maintaining their positions on the walls, the silence deepening as the night approaches that darkest hour just before dawn, when the world seems most still and most removed from the busy activity of daylight hours, when time itself seems to pause and hold its breath before the cycle begins again, before the baker rises from his bed and descends the stairs to begin another day's work, before the fire is rebuilt and new dough is mixed and the whole process starts over. The endless repetition that characterizes life in a bakery, that characterizes most human work when examined closely, the doing of similar tasks day after day, week after week, year after year, finding meaning not in novelty, but in the perfection of familiar actions, in the satisfaction of work done well, in the knowledge that one's labor serves a necessary purpose and meets a genuine need. Deep in the Victorian era, as we rest together in the warmth and silence of an oven where the bread-making process is complete. Thank you so much for allowing me to share this tranquil hour with you. If you found this peaceful journey relaxing, you might consider leaving a quiet comment below, or subscribing, commenting, and liking to join us for more gentle explorations in the quiet corners of history. I wish you a good rest and a sleep as soft as the crumbs of freshly baked bread. Remember, tomorrow is the first day of the rest of your life. Good night.